Over the Christmas period of 1994, a very distinctive hijacking of a passenger plane took place at the airport at the Algerian capital of Algiers. 232 people were taken hostage on board this Air France plane bound for Paris. The motives of the hijackers were shocking, and they were prepared to die and take the lives of everyone on board for their cause. A stalemate lasting days ensued as a feud in international politics between two nations held the plane on the ground in Algiers. The hijackers wanted to take the plane to Paris. The plane wouldn't make it that far, only ever making it as far as Marseille, where French special forces intervened. In this video, we'll follow the timeline of events during this attack, looking at the events of each of the 3 days and the fallout from such an event. On Christmas Eve of 1994, an Air France Airbus A300 passenger plane was making a trip between Paris and Algiers, the capital of Algeria. Algeria in 1994 had been in a state of civil war for just under 3 years by that point. The Algerian Civil War wouldn't end until 2001. Despite this conflict, Air France continued servicing the Algerian capital. One might have questions as to why an airline would continue to fly their aircraft and crew into areas of crisis. To understand this, it's important to note that during this civil war, Algeria still had a government which was supported by France. Air France prior to 2003 was largely a state-owned air carrier, and it was in the interest of the French state to continue support to the Algerian government. Thus, these flights continued. People and goods still needed to move in and out of the country. For more information on the Algerian Civil War, please find in the description a video explaining this conflict in detail. During takeoff and landing at Algiers, ground-to-air missile strikes were not out of the question. All Air France crew members that made these Algiers flights were volunteers, knowing the risks of flying to such a precarious place. On the flight deck of the A300 was a crew of 3. 51-year-old Captain Bernard Delem was a senior pilot at Air France. He was joined on the flight deck by his co-pilot, First Officer Jean-Paul Broderie, and flight engineer Alain Bossat. The third member of the crew was necessary as this was the older variant of the A300, which required the flight engineer role. The plane would arrive at Algiers Airport in the morning. The aircraft was to unload passengers and cargo and reload the aircraft for a swift turnaround, and be ready for the departure back to Paris Orly Airport at 11:15 a.m. Passengers had boarded the aircraft as normal. Nearly half of the passengers were Algerian. Many were heading to France to visit family, with it being the holiday season. French nationals also made up a significant percentage of passengers on board. The rest were a mix of German, Dutch, Norwegian, Irish, British, American, and one passenger, a Vietnamese diplomatic attaché to the Vietnamese embassy in Algiers, 48-year-old Bui Giang To. All appeared to be normal as the final passengers board and the flight crew were preparing for the flight ahead. Shortly before departure, however, 4 men who many passengers would describe as being in their early 20s boarded the aircraft while the air stairs were still connected to the front of the plane. They appeared to identify themselves as police, dressed in blue uniforms branded with the logo of the Algerian national airline Air Algérie. The men boarded the plane armed, as noted by flight attendant Claude Bonniard, with Soviet Kalashnikov assault rifles, Uzis, grenades, and even one was in possession of dynamite. Despite this, they initially did not appear threatening, and this was asserted by the fact that they stated that they were there to perform a passport check. These men, if you haven't caught on, were not police, but in fact were a group of 4 hijackers from the Armed Islamic Group or GIA Mujahideen of Algeria. I would like to make note of something. This was a terrorist group, not representative of Algeria. I ask you as viewers to remain objective in your assertions. Any comments on this video deemed to be harassing, threatening, or intimidating towards marginalized groups will not be tolerated and your comment will be removed. The GIA had been formed following a military coup which took place in 1992. The group had been employing tactics of kidnappings and bombings against the Algerian government, which was backed by France. They saw Air France as an entity of the French state, and so deemed Flight 8969 as an ideal target for hijacking. Their intention was to use the plane as a bomb to be blown up over the Eiffel Tower. The passengers and crew were obviously unaware of this when the men first boarded the plane. The leader of the group entered the flight deck. One hijacker guarded the door to the cockpit, while two other men began walking through the cabin pretending to perform a passport check. Captain Ditlevsen would make a PA announcement. Algerian military stationed at the airport began having suspicions as Flight 8969 should have departed by now. They decided to mobilize the Algerian Special Intervention Group. To locals, they are colloquially known as the Ninjas. Upon discovering that Algerian authorities have acted on the flight's delay, the hijackers swiftly revealed that they were Mujahideen, the leader announcing, "Allah has chosen us to die, and has also chosen you to die with us. Allah guarantees our success." The man who was quoted shouting this was 25-year-old Abdul Abdallah Yahya. He was a former greengrocer in Algiers turned militant. One of the men, simply named Lotfi, insisted that their new hostages follow Islamic law and found that women with uncovered heads was intolerable, as was men and women sitting together and sharing lavatories. Thus the cabin was segregated. Very quickly, an international crisis had mounted. The French Prime Minister of the time, Edouard Balladur, had been called back to office from his Christmas vacation and immediately was on the phone to the Algerian government. While on the ground in Algiers, 2 hours had now passed since the hijackers boarded the plane. They demanded to speak to the tower from the plane's radio. Yahya, over the radios, announced, "We are soldiers of mercy. Allah has selected us as his soldiers, and we are here to wage war in his name." An Algerian government minister had arrived at the airport to negotiate with the hijackers. They demanded the release of Abbasi Madani and Ali Balaj, two leaders of the Islamic Salvation Front who had been placed under house arrest. That group had been recently banned in the country. They were then told that if they wanted to talk to the Algerian government, they must release children and elderly passengers from the plane. The hijackers did not comply and demanded that the plane take off. The Airbus, however, was not going anywhere. The airstairs were still connected to the plane, and by this point, Algerian special forces had vehicles surrounding the plane. A ground power unit was not connected to the aircraft. Instead, the A300 was getting its power from the auxiliary power unit which was left running. The auxiliary power unit, or APU, is a small jet engine mounted at the rear of the plane. It generates power using the plane's fuel supply to allow the plane to be powered independently from the ground. The hijackers want to leave for Paris to hold a press conference, but the Algerian military won't let them and does not concede to any of their demands. Their desire to hold a press conference is interesting, as it was likely not their intention, instead using it as a decoy to get the plane in the air to use it as a bomb. In this situation, the captain and other flight crew members are not fighting the hijackers. It would be counterproductive to do so given their firepower. In a 2005 documentary, Captain Ditlevsen noted that in a hijacking situation, the role of the crew is to keep peace, earn some of the hijackers' trust, and keep drawing the situation out to buy time. The captain was then forced to ask for the airstairs to be removed, but still the Algerians do not concede. When the hijackers initially posed as police performing a passport check, it was noted that a member of Algerian law enforcement was on board. He was approached by the men and asked to leave the plane. The door was opened. He was then shot and killed as he entered the airstairs, becoming the first passenger to be murdered on the flight. Few passengers were aware of this at first, the flight crew having no idea that one of their passengers had just been murdered by the hijackers. It was not until a flight attendant was allowed to enter the cockpit that the news was shared with Captain Ditlevsen. In France, the French government insisted to Algeria that they either intervene or allow the plane to fly to another airport in Europe, suggesting the airport at Palma on the Spanish Balearic island of Majorca. From the perspective of the Algerian government, they did not want foreign intervention to solve an Algerian political crisis. However, given that this was a French-registered plane with a significant number of passengers being French, and most passengers being French-speaking civilians, An international crisis was mounting. The situation in Algiers was at a stalemate. The hijackers want to leave, but authorities are not budging. It was becoming clear to those on board, especially among Air France crew members, that things were not going well for the hijackers. They decided that another passenger would now be killed. Vietnamese diplomatic attaché Buick Yang To was approached by the hijackers, likely, as noted by passengers and cabin crew, singled out for being the only person on board the flight to be of Asian origin. He was collected, taken to the airstairs, and was shot and killed, becoming the second passenger to be murdered. Night was approaching, as several hours had now passed since the crisis began. As the dark sky loomed, the plane was lit with spotlights. The pilots would attempt to talk and hold conversation with the hijackers, but the plane was not going anywhere. It was now Christmas Day. During the night going into December 25th, Spanish authorities allowed France to station French counterterrorism forces, the GIGN, at Mallorca Airport. The GIGN was allowed to board a similar A300 to familiarize themselves with the aircraft layout. They were accompanied by a flight crew to supply technical information. Preparations were being made for storming the aircraft. Captain Ditlevsen was able to make his way around the cabin in the early hours of the morning. He would note that the atmosphere was a tense calm. Later in the morning, it was decided that some passengers would be released. Women with younger children were freed, totaling 63 passengers. They had also agreed to allow all remaining Algerian passengers to leave the plane, but interestingly, the Algerian passengers largely refused. As the day progressed, the Algerian government tried a different tactic. The lead hijacker, Abdullah Yahya, had been identified. His own mother had been brought to the airport to try and reconcile with her son. The plan backfired. Yahya was furious and was sent into what was described to be an uncontrollable rage according to passengers and flight attendants. Yahya now orders that a French citizen be killed. There were 2 members of staff from the French embassy on board. A young chef named Yannick Bunet was brought to the flight deck to talk with Algerian authorities. He pleaded over the radio before he was taken to the aircraft door where he was shot. A 3rd passenger had now been killed. The hijackers threatened that they would start killing 1 passenger for every 30 minutes the plane was still left standing on the ground. Now that a French national had been murdered, the French government then sternly threatened Algeria. France would hold Algeria accountable for whatever happens during the crisis if the plane was not allowed to leave Algiers. One source and some have speculated that the French threatened to withdraw international support for the Algerian government. The escalation of the crisis becoming more of an international incident and the threats made by the French government makes Algeria concede, and the plane is allowed to leave Algiers in the evening of December 25th, 39 hours after the crisis began. Air France Flight 8969 would make its way to Marseille on the southern coast of France. Because the plane had been on the ground for so long with the APU running, it had drained a significant amount of its fuel supply and now can't make it to Paris. The hijackers agreed to refuel in Marseille. Air France Flight 8969 began making its approach to Marseille's airport in the very early hours of Boxing Day. Unbeknownst to the hijackers, the French government had already mobilized the GIGN Special Forces to the airport, headed by French Commander Denis Favier. Word had gotten back to the French government about the hijackers' intentions. Passengers who were released in Algiers had obviously talked and mentioned the explosives the hijackers were carrying. Upon landing, the A300 was deliberately taxied to a remote stand in the corner of the apron away from the terminal. With the crisis now going into its 3rd day, Favier had assumed the hijackers would now be tired, and the plan was to prolong any kind of negotiations to wear them down further. The French's suspicions on the hijackers' intentions would become clearer when they requested a full tank of 27 tons of fuel to be loaded onto the plane. The plane would not need anywhere near that amount in reality for the short flight to Paris. Given the intel the French government received, it was decided that no matter the price, the plane would not leave Marseille. The time was now 8 a.m. on Boxing Day. Abdullah Yahya requests that the plane takes off by 9:30 a.m. He does, however, agree to a press conference in Marseille with the international press. The airport supplies cleaning and catering staff. Water and food was to be delivered to the plane. The staff performing these duties were in fact GIGN operatives disguised as regular Marseille airport ground staff. Listening devices would also be planted. During negotiations with the hijackers in preparation for this press conference, it was requested that the front of the plane be cleared for passengers. This was a deliberate move by French authorities to clear an area with no civilians for the GIGN to move in when storming the aircraft. A plan of action had now been formulated. With the help of the previously planted listening devices, the GIGN now know just how many hijackers there are and their locations on the plane. They now wanted to wait for night to come to take advantage of the dark. Yahya suspected correctly that they were up to something and ordered Captain Ditlevsen to move the aircraft. The Airbus A300 in the afternoon then moved close to the terminal, control tower, and other aircraft. They demand that fuel be loaded by 5 p.m. or they leave anyway. The GIGN had been planning their assault with the knowledge that the plane would be parked on a remote stand away from the terminal. They need to quickly reevaluate their plans and act swiftly. Snipers had been relocated to the top of the airport terminal and control tower. 5 p.m. had now come and gone. Abdullah Yahya entered the cabin to pick out a fourth person to execute. Eyewitnesses report him being hesitant. Instead, shots were fired from the hijackers towards the control tower through the window in the cockpit. It was now time for the storming of the plane to begin. The plan formed by the GIGN was now as follows. The GIGN would take 3 sets of air stairs and approach the aircraft from behind. 2 teams would approach the 2 aft doors on either side, and 1 other on the front right side door. Whether or not the hijackers knew the doors could be opened from the outside is unknown. The GIGN knows that most passengers are now in the back of the plane. The front team would secure the cockpit, knowing the leader of the group was in there with the flight crew, while the other hijackers were also positioned at the front of the plane. The hijackers noticed the approaching airport vehicles and moved into action. The raid was recorded by French news broadcasters. The 2 teams of GIGN forces at the back of the plane would move through the cabin, secure it, and once no threat of any armed hijackers was noted, the passengers were to be evacuated. The use of the plane's emergency escape slides was also applied. At the front of the plane, following a small struggle to access the fuselage, the front right door was opened and the GIGN entered the front of the cabin, where gunfire quickly ensued. 1 hijacker was quickly neutralized. Muzzle flashes can be seen in this footage through the cockpit window. The hijackers in the cockpit began shooting through the walls and into the cabin, injuring 1 member of the GIGN. Several hundreds of bullets would be fired during the siege. Grenades had also been used. As the right side cockpit window was open, the first officer Jean-Paul Borderie seizes the moment to escape through the window and drops from the flight deck to the concrete below. This allowed the GIGN to try and throw grenades through the opened window. Snipers could now get a good view of the hijackers inside the cockpit and shot and killed 2 of them. Captain Ditlevsen and First Officer Alain Bossat were still in the cockpit. Just minutes after the raid started, all passengers had been evacuated from the plane. The 1 remaining hijacker was able to stand off with the GIGN for around 20 minutes. Another GIGN member was injured when a round from a Kalashnikov detonated their ammunition. The force had thrown them down the air stairs. He would later recover. The situation would be brought under control as the final hijacker chose not to kill the 2 remaining pilots on the plane. He was eventually killed by the GIGN, and the crisis of Flight 8969 was brought to an end. In the end, 3 passengers were killed during the hostage crisis. The flight and cabin crew were awarded with honors for their efforts in the face of death. It was revealed that the hijackers' plot was to use the plane as a bomb in Paris. The raid of Air France Flight 8969 is used as a case study for how to neutralize a terrorist threat in counter-terrorism training. The terrorist organization involved in the incident would never attempt the same plot again. The Algerian Civil War ended in 2001, and Air France continues to fly to Algiers to this day. As for the Airbus A300 plane involved, due to the damage it had sustained during the raid, it was written off and scrapped. Hello, good evening everyone. I hope you're all well tonight. Thanks for making it to the end of another long video. I certainly didn't expect this one to be as long as it is, but here we are. A couple of things to note here. From Sunday the 5th of September, I will be taking a week off. I am going to try and make sure that I can get a video ready so that there will still be a video that following weekend, but I'll keep you posted on the community tab if anything changes. I am also looking for a bit of help from anyone who does repaints in the X-Plane Flight Simulator. There is a livery I am needing for a video that I want to make but isn't available, so if you are into texturing and X-Plane, head over to the community tab to see what is needed. Thanks very much in advance. Anyway, it is time to thank my patrons for their incredible support. If you would like to get your name featured here or read out at the end of the next video, as well as getting all videos 48 hours early before they go out on YouTube, you can join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from £3 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. A thank you to my £5 tier patrons, Aidan Montgomery, Hector Palmatellas, Jugis, Ken Zachman, Kevin Connors, Christy, Leon Sant Jennings, Marie Innes, MG, Pacman7, Panic Chicken, Rebecca Rivers, who was a new joiner, Surya Melody, SoFP, and Sue So's Shoes. And a big thanks to my generous £10 tier patrons for their incredible support. Alex Keller, Ann Sid, Danielle Hendricks, Derek Bean, Mike Milton, Side Effect, Roger Mayer, and Where Are My Cheetos? Thank you all so much. One thing to note to patrons, if in future you don't want me to read your name out, just send me a message and I'll make sure to fix that for you. Anyways, thank you all so much, and that is it for me this week. Have a good weekend, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.